Okay, we're back. Concept 2.3. Let's move on. Let's get into some larger things other than single atoms or talking only about one particular element. So concept 2.3 says the formation and function of molecules, so we're up from just a single atom, depends on chemical bonding between the atoms. And chemical bonds are the attractions that results when atoms combine or interact with one another. So atoms that don't have complete valence shells, in other words, they don't have that outer shell filled, and they're not what we used to say in middle school. We would say that if they're unhappy, that atoms are happy when they have that outer layer filled and unhappy when they don't. Certainly your chemistry teacher would probably cringe at that, but it's an idea that works well for middle school kids. So when atoms have incomplete valence shells, they are looking to either share or transfer electrons to try to fill that shell and get to where they are in a satisfied state, or a more stable state is actually what they're trying to reach, a state more similar to the noble gases on the far right of the periodic table. And they do that through chemical bonding. You're probably familiar with the fact that there's two primary types of chemical bonds. The first one we're going to talk about is covalent bonding. Covalent, based on the name, you can probably guess, together or sharing, and valent, that outer layer. Covalent bonding is the sharing of electrons, valence electrons, between two atoms. And in this case, these shared electrons kind of spend their time in between or among both of the atoms and satisfies both of the requirements of that outer shell. So if we have two hydrogen atoms here, they can covalently bond. In other words, their cloud of electrons that you see, remember we have this kind of fuzzy cloud to represent that. Normally they only have a single electron around each of the atoms. That does not fulfill the need to have the two for that first level. But if they are covalently bonded, they tend to share one of these electrons. And so you end up where, in a way, if you wanted to personify the atom, you could say it thinks that it's got the two that it needs, even though they're actually sharing the one. So that's a covalent bond. A molecule is what we call an atom, or what we call a configuration of two or more atoms held together by covalent bonds. You can have a single covalent bond, like here they're sharing a single electron, that's a single covalent bond. Or you can have a double covalent bond, where they're actually sharing two pairs of electrons. And there's a couple different ways to represent this, of course. We could draw it like you saw previously, or we could write it out with what's called a structure or structural formula. So here we have the single line that represents a single covalent bond between the two hydrogen atoms. We could even write it out with the molecular formula here. The molecular formula would just be H2. The 2 would tell you that there are two hydrogens and they are bonded together with the single covalent bond. So again, we have a couple different ways to show this. We do have an animation. The animation won't play in this particular view, but if you go take a look at the notes on PowerPoint, you can see this, and I'll also put this animation up in the materials. If you want to see this particular animation, you can go there as well. Here we have a table that kind of shows different ways to show these bonds: hydrogen, oxygen, water, and methane. And so here's a summary, and then we'll take a quick look at each one of those just really briefly here. So if we look at the hydrogen, we can write it out with words and numbers. We can draw an electron distribution diagram. Notice that they seem to be sharing. They kind of have an overlap of that electron shell. We have what's called a Lewis dot structure. A Lewis dot structure would either be using the dots or a structural formula where they use a line. In the Lewis dot structure, they use the dots, individual dots, to represent the electrons. In the structural formula, they use a single drawn line. Or we could have like a three-dimensional model. And of course, this would be somewhat more representative of what it would look like if we could actually see it with our own eyes. So taking a look at some of the others, you can see various covalent bonds. With oxygen, we have a double covalent bond. So oxygen actually is sharing two electrons. So it has a double covalent bond. You can see that here in the Lewis dot diagram and the structural diagram as well. Going up to water, here we have oxygen has a single covalent bond, but with two different atoms. So each of these atoms are in a covalent bond with the single oxygen atom. And then finally we get to carbon. Carbon is such an amazing part of biology because of its chemistry, because it can make so many bonds. Carbon can make a wide number of bonds. So here carbon is bonding with 4 different hydrogen atoms in single covalent bonds, and that makes the molecule methane, CH4, natural gas. That's what makes cow farts smell and adds to the global warming problem that we have. As you saw, covalent bonds can form between atoms of the same element, like for example O2, which is the oxygen floating around in the air, is a covalent bond, double covalent bond between 2 oxygen atoms. Or you can have what's called a compound, and a compound is a combination of 2 or more different elements, like water is a compound, and it is covalent bonds between the hydrogen and the oxygen atom. The bonding capacity, or the ability to bond, is called the atom's valence. So the greater the bonding capacity, the greater the valence. Another term that we sometimes talk about is electronegativity. For example, the atoms in a molecule or the atoms in a particular compound, they don't always have the same pull or attraction to the electrons. Some of them are stronger than others. Like a good example is water. The oxygen atom tends to pull the electrons toward it more than the hydrogen atoms do. So we say the oxygen has greater electronegativity. I used to kind of analogize that to brothers and sisters. If you have, say, an older sister and 2 twin younger brothers, and they have to share a bag of M&Ms, you can pretty much guarantee that the larger, stronger, older sister is going to get more than 1/3 her share of that bag of M&Ms, and the younger twins are going to get slightly less than their 1/3 share. If all the atoms involved share those electrons equally, we call that a non-polar covalent bond. But if they don't share them equally, what we end up having is one part of the atom has a slightly greater negative charge and one part of the atom ends up slightly more positive. And we call that a polar covalent bond. That's unequal sharing. So the atom or the compound or molecule as a whole may be neutral, but there are portions of it that are more negative and more positive. Water is a great example. It looks like Mickey Mouse. The oxygen portion of the molecule here, the oxygen portion of the compound, has a greater negative charge, and the hydrogen ends tend to have a greater positive charge because oxygen has a greater electronegativity and pulls the shared electrons toward it more, doesn't share those electrons equally with its smaller little element siblings. The second type of chemical bonding that you're probably familiar with is ionic bonds. Sometimes certain elements have such strong electronegativity or pull on electrons, or they have such a disparate number of electrons that instead of sharing, they actually transfer. They either give up or take electrons from another atom. And this would be called an ionic bond because when you transfer electrons, you're going to have charges. So the atom that takes on the extra electron or electrons is going to be negative. The atom that gives up the electron or electrons is going to be positive. So we call that charged atom or molecule, the charged particle, an ion. So this is known as ionic bonding. A good example is the salt that we talked about earlier. So with salt, if we look at the sodium side over here, sodium has 1 electron in its outer shell, and it would be almost impossible for it to gain the number of electrons necessary to fill that shell. It'd be far easier to lose that outer electron and then drop down to 2 filled shells as an ion. Chlorine is in the opposite position. Chlorine has 7 outer electrons, and again, almost impossible for it to get rid of all 7 of those, but far easier to steal an electron or take on an electron from somewhere else, and then that fills that outer shell and brings it to a stable, complete state. So what we have is sodium giving up the electron, chlorine taking on that electron, and that creates 2 ions. From that point forward, we can have an ionic bond. So when that happens, sodium becomes positively charged because it has lost one of its negative charges. And the chlorine becomes negatively charged, -1, because it has gained negative charge. And just like in a magnet or a situation similar to the opposite poles of electronegativity or the opposite poles of charge, when we have a positive and negative, they're drawn together. And that drawing together is the bond, the ionic bond that we're talking about. We do have specific names for these charged particles. If it's the positively charged particle, for example, that would be the sodium. In that case, it would be called a cation. And if it's the negatively charged particle, the chlorine, in that case, it's called the anion. And so an ionic bond is the attraction between these two positive and negative particles. We do have an animation to show the ionic bonds as well. Again, it won't show in this particular view, but if you go look at the notes in PowerPoint, or if you go to the Materials tab of Schoology, or Schoology, however we pronounce it, I will have this animation up as well, and you can click on it and take a look. So compounds that are formed from ionic bonds are called ionic compounds, or commonly called salts. A good example, of course, is the table salt sodium chloride that we were talking about. In nature, it takes on a crystalline form oftentimes, and that's because of the molecular arrangement. So if we could zoom into the crystal to look at the specific molecules and how the atoms are arranged, they're arranged in a repeating pattern, and that repeating pattern shows itself as a crystalline structure. When we examine these chemical bonds, specifically in biology, we might see that they're not all of the same strength. The strongest bonds in most organisms are these covalent bonds that form, say, the molecular structure of the creature. But there are also other bonds, such as these weaker ionic bonds and bonds called hydrogen bonds. They are perhaps not quite as important, but they help form the shape of large molecules like proteins and lipids, and they help with the interaction. So we're going to take a quick look at them as well. Hydrogen bonds are the bond that are formed when a hydrogen atom covalently bonds to an electronegative atom, but is also attracted to another electronegative atom. And for example, water does this all the time, but here they're showing water and ammonia. So at the top here we have the water molecule, and we know that this hydrogen is bonded to this oxygen, but we know that it's a polar molecule. In other words, the oxygen tends to be more negative, and the hydrogen tends to be a little bit more positive. Well, here we have another molecule. This one is of ammonia, and it works very similar in that the nitrogen tends to be slightly more negative, and the hydrogens are slightly more positive. Again, because nitrogen pulls on those electrons just a bit more. Well, that interaction sets up the possibility of what we call a hydrogen bond. And this hydrogen bond is a weak bond that occurs between this slightly positive hydrogen part and the slightly negative nitrogen part. This, when we talk about water later on, it helps kind of explain a lot of the properties of water, such as water tension and capillary action. So we'll get into that in more detail. But this is a weak bond. It's constantly broken and reformed. But between the slightly negative hydrogen and another molecule, the slightly positive hydrogen and the slightly negative end of another molecule, there can form this attraction, this hydrogen bond. There's an even weaker bond that can form just simply because electrons are not always distributed equally or symmetrically all around the molecule or the atom. So you'll sometimes develop these areas that are slightly more negative or slightly more positive, and that's always changing. But when you have an area slightly more negative, it can be attracted, even for a brief moment, to an area that's slightly more positive. We call these van der Waals interactions. And you wouldn't think that they would have any great effect. And if you look at the individual molecules, they don't have much of an effect. They're not strong enough really to do much. But if you add up hundreds or thousands, millions of molecules, and you have these little interactions going on, you can see some actual results and changes. So a great example that is often used is the fact that geckos these little lizards that have little pads on the ends of their toes. If you look at it under a microscope, these little pads have tiny, tiny, tiny little hairs, and these little hairs each have a van der Waal interaction with the surface that the lizard or gecko is walking on. So the reason the gecko can climb the wall or perhaps even hang upside down on a ceiling is actually electrical van der Waal interactions between the suction cups or the little hairs on the ends of his toes. So I said suction cups, but it's really not suction cups. It's not air pressure or suction that's causing that. It's these tiny microscopic little hairs that you can only see under a microscope, and all of the van der Waals interactions that occur between those hairs and the surface that the lizard is climbing or walking on. Later on this semester, when we start talking about proteins and cells and cell parts, we'll talk a lot about protein shape or molecule shape. Molecule shape is very important in how it reacts with other molecules and how it functions, particularly within living creatures, human bodies, and things like that. The molecule shape is kind of determined by the position of its various orbitals. So we talked about how you can have s orbitals and these various p orbitals, and what happens is when these orbitals interact, they form various shapes. So for example, the shape of water, this Mickey Mouse shape with this particular angle between the hydrogens, that's a result of the various orbitals. Or the shape, kind of this pyramid shape, methane, that's the result of the orbitals. And so this shape of molecule actually becomes very important, particularly when we're talking about biology, and we'll discuss that again a little bit later on. A quick example of, in biology, how the molecule shape has an effect is, say, for example, when you compare the shape of the endorphin molecule, which is a naturally produced chemical inside your body, and you compare that to the shape of morphine, which is a chemical that's man-created. So within the body's receptor sites, the brain in the body has pain perception receptor sites, and the same receptor site, here you have endorphin receptors within the cell that accepts this natural endorphin that the body creates. It will also accept this morphine molecule, and that's because of the shape, particularly where it attaches. The lower part of each of these molecules is very, very similar. So it's almost like you have a certain lock, and here is the original key that the lock was designed to work with. But this key is so similar that it will actually work as well. So the reason that morphine has the effect that it does on the human body is because it mimics the natural endorphin chemicals that the body creates. Oh, my phone's going off. And that's because the shape of the molecule here is very, very similar. All right, let's finish up. Concept 2.4, it's a short one, so we're going to go ahead and push on through here. Concept 2.4, the last concept for this chapter, says that chemical reactions make and break chemical bonds. If we want anything to happen, we have to have chemical reactions. In other words, you have to have this interaction between those valence electrons in that outer shell. And you're probably familiar with this. We're going to start with what we call reactants. So reactants are the materials, the atoms and elements and compounds that you began with. And then you're going to have a reaction that's either going to release energy or it's going to require an input of energy. And you're going to end up with what we call products. So your products are basically your final pieces, or what you ended up with. In this case, our reactants are hydrogen and oxygen, and it's creating, this arrow is kind of like a one-way equal sign to some degree. It's creating products. Here we have two H2O water molecules. That's our basic formula. A good example is photosynthesis, perhaps one of the most important, greatest chemical reactions on the planet. Today, when you go outside, when you leave your classroom or leave your house, make sure you hug the nearest tree, because without those photosynthetic creatures, we wouldn't be around. So photosynthesis is a great example where the plant takes in carbon dioxide from the air, takes in water from the soil. You're going to have an input of energy in the form of sunlight, and that's going to form this molecule C6H12O6. That's our product, glucose, and oxygen is a byproduct that's given off by the plant. Thank goodness for us, right? So here we have a water plant called Elodia or Elodia. It's a freshwater plant, And if you look closely, you see little bubbles forming on the leaves. What this plant is doing is it's producing sugar. It's producing C6H12O6, and it's doing that by taking the carbon dioxide and the water and recombining them in a chemical process. And that chemical process, that reaction, is powered by the sun. So much of that sugar is then converted to other types of food molecules for the plant, and the oxygen, the byproduct, is being released through the stomata of the leaves. Here you see these tiny little bubbles being released. In our chemical equation, I said the arrow is kind of like a one-way equal sign. That's not completely true. All chemical reactions are technically reversible, but some tend to favor one side of the reaction more than the other. Some to such a degree that you would almost consider them very difficult or irreversible. In any chemical reaction, you're going to reach an eventual equilibrium, and the chemical equilibrium is when the two reactions basically settle down to where the reaction rates are equal for both the forward and the reverse. We'll talk perhaps a bit more about that when we get into the biology of the cells and some of the chemistry involved there. If you would like to see a different version of some of this information, let me suggest that you head on over to YouTube and you look up Crash Course. If you go to our course YouTube channel, it's one of the favorites on the right-hand side. But if you just go to YouTube and you look up Crash Course, it's an entire YouTube channel, educational channel, and look up Crash Course Chemistry. If you're not familiar with Hank Green, he's one of the Vlog Brothers, and if you're not familiar with the Vlog Brothers, that's a whole nother site that I suggest you check out on YouTube. But some great information there. Hank is very entertaining. He's got far better production values than I do here. So there's a link down at the bottom. But if you go to YouTube and go to Crash Course Chemistry, it's probably a 12 or 15-minute video, and it'll kind of go over some of the same information that we just hit. But I'm telling you, Hank is a bit more entertaining than me, even though I know that's hard to believe. We're going to stop right there. That's Chapter 2. Let's wrap it up. We're headed off to Chapter 3. You guys have a good day. Bye.